Welcome back to another MECH 1000 video in which we are going to learn how to modify our dimensions. So in a previous video I showed you how to place dimensions, and we created these linear, angular dimensions, a radius, and a diameter. Now placing dimensions is important, but perhaps just as important is learning how to modify them. For instance, the default template in AutoCAD wants to place a whole bunch of zeros, a whole bunch of decimal places on our linear, radius, and diameter dimensions. And we know from our blueprint reading that that is significant. The number of zeros frequently indicates the tolerance level. And so by having an unnecessary amount of zeros, you're implying an unnecessarily strict tolerance level on the making of this part. So we do not want to leave zeros. If we just need this to be 2.00, we don't want it to say 2.0000. We want to get rid of those extra zeros. The way we can do that across the board for all of our dimensions is to go to the Annotate tab, and in the lower right corner of the Dimensions toolbar, we want to click that little arrow symbol. That's going to bring up the Dimension Style Manager. Now, I prefer using standard dimensions. This little symbol right here next to the word annotative, that's a whole different type of dimension that I prefer to just avoid. So I recommend my students use standard dimensions, and we do not want to override, we want to modify. We want to modify the current standard dimension style. So after this dialog box comes up, we select Modify. Now there are lots of things you can modify in this dialog box. You can specify the color of lines that are being used for your dimension lines and your extension lines. You can click these boxes to suppress or turn off dimension lines or extension lines. You can edit the amount that the extension lines extend beyond the dimension lines. You can change your closed filled arrows to some other type of symbol here. If you're doing an architectural drawing, for instance, you might want to change that to an architectural tick. So there are lots of things that you can change, but in this class, in MECH 1000, we really don't need to change any of these things except for a couple important things that I want to point out. So let's start with the precision level. As I mentioned, we don't want an unnecessary amount of zeros. Right now, the precision level is set to 4 decimal places. That is definitely more than we need. Most of our drawings have either 2 or 3 decimal places. So let's say I want to make it 2 decimal places. I click right there and hit OK and close. And that changes all of the linear dimensions, radius, diameter. If I had an aligned dimension on here, it would have changed that too. So that changes all of them at once. Now let's say I have one particular dimension that is different. Let's say I want all of these to have 2 decimal places, but this one I want to have 3. I want it to be different. You can click on it to highlight it, right-click, and bring up its properties. And in this properties bar right here, I can see a lot of those same options that were present in the Dimension Style Manager. And so if I look down here, it should be under Primary Units. The precision level is right here. So I can change that. Now if I change it using the Properties dialog box, it only changes the properties of that particular dimension. It does not change the style of the dimension, which affects all of them. Oop, I don't want to close out of my drawing, just the Properties dialog box. There we go. So you may have noticed that our angular dimension here has no decimal places. So in order to change the precision level of angular dimensions, that is a separate style that we need to change. or modify. So again, we'll click in the lower right corner of the annotate, or rather the dimensions toolbar, or we can use the keyboard shortcut dim style. So I'm just typing DIMSTYLE, all one word, and hitting enter. And that also brings up the Dimension Style Manager. And again, I can go to Modify, Primary Units, and you'll notice when I changed the precision level before, that was for linear dimensions. For angular dimensions, the precision level is down here. So I can change that to 2 decimal places. Or if we needed to, we could change our angular dimensions to be in degrees, minutes, and seconds. And then you can set the precision to just degrees, just minutes, or degrees, minutes, and seconds. Okay, so changing the precision level is very important. I frequently see students neglecting to do this, and it is one of the leading causes of missing points on drawings for Chapter 8 onward. In addition to changing the precision level, you may also need to change the scale of your dimensions. Let's say for a moment that we had a very large drawing, relatively large drawing. I'll just draw a big rectangle. Okay, and so if I want to dimension the width of that rectangle, I'll switch back to my annotation layer and place a linear dimension from here to here. Okay, now can you see the width of that rectangle? I know I can't. I'd have to zoom way in order to read that dimension, 89.5. So clearly the scale of this dimension is not adequate for the scale of the drawing. I need to make this much larger so that it can actually be read. And so to do that, again, we want to go back to the Dimension Style Manager and modify our dimension style. Now, what I see students doing sometimes, students just kind of messing around, not knowing what they're doing, they might go in and just change the text height. But we don't want to do that. We want to change everything about the dimension. We want to not only change the size of the text, but we want to change the size of the arrow. We want to change the proportionally the length that the extension line extends beyond the dimension line. We want to increase the size of this gap between the extension line and the object being dimensioned. We want to scale everything up uniformly. We do not just want to change the scale of the text. So what we need to do is go to Modify. We do not want to be on the Text tab. We want to be on the Fit tab. And we want to change the overall scale. So we want to change the overall scale. That's going to scale everything up proportionally. So right now the scale is 1. What I usually suggest is that you use a scale for the text that is proportional to the paperspace scale or the viewport scale used in paperspace. So in other words, if you're using 1/4 of an inch equals a foot scale, you have to ask yourself how many 1/4 of an inch are there in a foot, and that's 48. So if we're using a 1/4 inch scale, we want to use a dimension scale of 48. And that looks like it's probably too big, depending, again, on the scale, the viewport scale being used. Let's get rid of all those. Those are going to be much too big now. So that might be too big, so maybe we don't want to use 48. Maybe we are just going to be using a 1/2 inch scale. 1/2 inch equals a foot scale for our viewport. Or actually, I'm thinking in architectural scales. If we're using a mechanical scale, maybe we're using a 1:2 scale. If we're using a 1:2 scale, that's a 1/2, which means we want to blow up our dimension by a factor of 2 to make the dimensions bigger by a scale of 2. That's still going to be too small. So let's try again. Maybe we're going to be using a 1 to 10 scale. So that means we want to scale up our dimensions by a factor of 10. And that seems maybe more like a reasonable dimension scale for this drawing. So it's a little bit of a trial and error, just trying to find the scale that works for you. But a lot of it is dependent upon the viewport scale. So if the viewport scale is 1 to 10, we want to use a dimension scale of 10. If the viewport scale is 1 to 2, we want to use a dimension scale of 2. And those are really the two most important things to remember. Again, we can type dim style or go to the annotate tab, click in the corner of the dimensions toolbar. We want to modify, not override. We want to leave the text alone. Instead, we want to adjust the overall scale of the fit. And we want to adjust the precision level of our linear dimensions and angular dimensions. So as long as you can do those basic things, adjust the scale and the precision level, then you can modify your dimensions to look appropriate for the given drawing.